The silence in the house was a physical thing. It had weight and texture, clinging to the velvet curtains Eleanor had loved and settling like a fine dust on the polished surface of the dining table. Before, it had been a house of sounds. The gentle clink of her teaspoon against a ceramic mug, the rustle of newspaper pages turning in the armchair by the fire, the distant, contented hum of her voice as she spoke to the roses in the garden. Now, the only sound was the mournful groan of the old floorboards under my feet, a sound that seemed to amplify the profound emptiness she had left behind. Grief was not a sharp, singular event, as I had once imagined it might be. It was a slow tide, creeping into every corner of my life, turning familiar landscapes into foreign territory. I felt like a foreigner in my own home, a custodian of artifacts whose true meaning had departed with their owner. I had spent the first 3 weeks after the funeral in a state of suspended animation. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting patterns of light across the living room rug. I moved through the rooms performing the rote tasks of existence. Making tea I rarely drank, washing dishes I barely used, staring out the window at the garden that was already beginning to show signs of neglect without Eleanor's hands to guide it. The rosemary bush she had planted by the back door, the one whose scent always clung to her clothes, was growing wild, its spindly branches reaching out as if searching for her. I would stand there, my hand hovering over the doorknob, unable to step into that space that was so completely hers. A garden, I had come to understand, is a conversation between a person and the land. Her half of the conversation had ended. It was paperwork that finally forced me to move, not the great, sorrowful stacks of condolences and official documents, but the small, mundane bills and statements that continued their relentless march into our mailbox. Paperwork is not company, but it is companionship of a kind. It demands a response. It forces one to acknowledge that time, for the rest of the world, has not stopped. I sat at her desk, a delicate mahogany piece she had inherited from her grandmother. The scent of her was still there, faint but distinct, a mix of lemon verbena hand cream and the dry, papery smell of old books. My fingers traced the worn grain of the wood, a landscape of memories mapped out in tiny scratches and indentations. Each one was a story. The deep gouge from a dropped pair of sewing scissors, the faint ring from a forgotten cup of tea, the smooth patch where her wrist had rested for 50 years. The desk was a model of her mind, outwardly orderly, but with a complex inner world of hidden compartments and meticulously organized chaos. I began to sort through the files, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were handling ancient, fragile relics. There were the household accounts, kept in a leather-bound ledger with her elegant, sloping handwriting filling every page. There were files for warranties on appliances that were now older than my grandchildren. There was a thick folder labeled Simply Garden, filled with seed catalogs, sketched-out planting diagrams, and notes on soil acidity. It was also Eleanor, practical, beautiful, and built to last. It was in the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old travel brochures for trips we had always planned to take, that I found it. A simple manila folder, thicker than the others, with no label. My first thought was that it was something she had forgotten to file. I lifted it out. It felt heavier than it should, dense with paper. I opened it on the blotter, the soft leather squeaking faintly under its weight. The first thing I saw was a letter, addressed to me in her unmistakable script. My breath caught in my throat. It was like hearing her voice again after a long silence. "My dearest Arthur," it began. I had to stop, my eyes blurring. I took off my glasses and rubbed them on my sweater, a pointless gesture of delay. Grief is a trickster. It ambushes you in the quietest moments, with the simplest of triggers. A word, a scent, a line of familiar handwriting. I read on. The letter was calm, loving, and devastatingly clear-sighted. She wrote of her love for me, of our life together, of the house we had built from 4 walls into a home. But then the tone shifted. She wrote about our children, Michael and Clara. She wrote with a sad, maternal pragmatism that I had often admired, but never fully understood until that moment. She had seen, long before I had been willing to admit it to myself, the direction in which they were heading. She described their love as transactional, their concern as a negotiation. She used a phrase that struck me like a physical blow. They love the idea of us, Arthur, but they value the assets. She explained that she had been making arrangements for years, quietly, without my knowledge. Not out of lack of trust in me, she insisted, but out of a desire to protect me from the pressure she knew would come. Grief makes you vulnerable, she wrote, and they will see your vulnerability as an opportunity. I will not have your sorrow be their leverage. Beneath the letter were the documents. It was a second life, codified in paper. There was a deed to a small house, a casa pequeña, according to the document, in a coastal village in Portugal I had never heard of. There were statements from a bank in Lisbon, showing a substantial account in her name, now legally transferred to mine upon presentation of her death certificate. There is a Portuguese passport for me, tucked inside a crisp blue folder, the photograph a younger, less weary version of myself, a picture she must have taken from an old album. There were detailed instructions, a list of contacts, and a separate, smaller envelope containing a key and a handwritten note with a single name, Sophia. I sat there for what must have been hours, the afternoon sun slanting across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The silence of the house had changed. It was no longer the silence of absence, but the silence of a held breath. The weight of my grief had not lifted, but it had shifted. It was now counterbalanced by something else, the sheer, breathtaking scale of my wife's foresight. She had not simply left me. She had left me a plan, a fortress, an escape. Some victories are quiet. They are not announced with trumpets, but with the soft click of a lock, the rustle of a page, the slow, dawning realization that you are not, in fact, trapped. Eleanor had given me such a victory. She had reached back from the great silence and handed me a shield. The phone rang later that day, its shrill cry tearing through the newfound quiet of my thoughts. It was Michael. His voice was full of a manufactured, business-like sympathy that set my teeth on edge. He had always approached emotion as if it were a line item on a balance sheet, something to be managed and accounted for before moving on to the real business. "Dad, how are you holding up?" he asked. The question was a formality, a box to be ticked. "I'm managing, Michael," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. Good, good. Listen, Dad, Clara, and I've been talking. I could picture him pacing in his minimalist office, his Bluetooth headset a permanent fixture on his ear. We've been doing some thinking, and we really believe it's time to start being practical. The market is peaking, you know. It's an incredible seller's market. I said nothing. The silence stretched, and I let it. Silence was a tool I was beginning to understand. It makes people uncomfortable. It makes them reveal themselves. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here." "Well, what I'm saying is, the house is just too much for you now. The upkeep, the garden's a lot. We've had an agent, a real top-tier guy, do a preliminary valuation. You'd be amazed. It would set you up for life. We could get you into a beautiful condo. Secure, no maintenance, community activities." He was selling me a future I had no interest in, using words that sounded like they were lifted from a glossy brochure. He spoke of the house not as a home, but as an asset to be liquidated. He saw the garden not as Eleanor's living legacy, but as a parcel of land with a certain value per square foot. The conversation was a perfect, textbook example of everything Eleanor had predicted in her letter. Her words echoed in my mind. They will see your vulnerability as an opportunity. "I'm not interested, Michael," I said, and the calmness in my own voice surprised me. "Dad, be reasonable. This isn't about what you're interested in. This is about what's smart, what's practical. You're rattling around in that big place all alone. It doesn't make sense." "It makes sense to me," I replied. "We're just trying to look out for you," he said, his tone shifting to one of strained patience, the kind a parent uses with a difficult child. "Clara feels the same way. We're worried." I knew what they were worried about. They were worried about their inheritance. They were worried about a volatile market. They were worried that my grief would make me irrational, that I might do something foolish with their asset. They had already mentally spent the money, dividing the spoils of a life I was still living. I ended the call, promising to think about it, a lie that tasted like ash in my mouth. I walked back to the desk and placed my hand on the manila folder. It felt warm, alive. It was not just a collection of documents. It was a conversation with my wife, one that was still ongoing. She had armed me not just with resources, but with clarity. She had given me permission to see my children for who they had become, not for who I wished they still were. A gardener knows that you cannot nurture a plant by wishing it were different. You have to see it for what it is. You have to understand its nature. Some plants are meant to climb, some are meant to spread, and some, no matter how much you tend to them, have shallow roots and will never provide the shade you hope for. My children had shallow roots. It was a painful realization, but a necessary one. Eleanor had known it, and now so did I. The decision was not a decision at all. It was an acceptance. I would not tell them. The knowledge of the house in Portugal, of the quiet life waiting for me there, was a secret I would hold close. It was a seed I needed to plant in silence and tend to in private. It was not just about the money or the property. It was about preserving the sanctity of Eleanor's final gift. It was about protecting my own dignity. Their greed would tarnish it, turn it into another line item on their spreadsheet, another asset to be appraised and debated. This was mine, ours, a final, secret collaboration between a husband and his wife. The wisdom of silence, I was beginning to learn, was not about withholding the truth. It was about protecting it. The days that followed took on a new rhythm. The tide of grief had not receded, but I was no longer adrift in it. I had a purpose, a quiet, methodical project that demanded my full attention. The first step was to understand the tools Eleanor had left me. I spent hours at her desk, the manila folder open before me, studying the documents as if they were sacred texts. I read and reread her letter, each time discovering a new layer of meaning, a new nuance in her careful phrasing. She had been building this arc for a decade, moving small amounts of money, navigating the complexities of international property law, establishing a network of trust with a woman I had never met. The sheer competence of it all was staggering. I had always known she was capable, but this was something else entirely. This was the work of a master strategist, operating in plain sight. I examined the deed. The property was in a village called Azenas do Mar, a name that rolled off the tongue like a gentle wave. I found on a map online. A cluster of whitewashed houses clinging to a cliffside, overlooking the vast, churning Atlantic. The pictures showed narrow, winding streets, blue-tiled walls, and the raw, untamed beauty of the coast. It was the kind of place we had dreamed of visiting, a landscape that spoke of history and resilience. The house itself, according to the legal description, was small, with a walled garden and a view of the sea. The phrase Jardim com Limoeiros, garden with lemon trees, was repeated twice. Eleanor had loved lemon trees. The bank statements from the Caixa Geral de Depósitos were clear and unambiguous. The account was healthy, more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my days without ever touching the proceeds from the sale of our current home, the sale my children were so eager to orchestrate. Eleanor had insulated me from their financial gravity. She had given me the one thing they could not understand or control: independence. The most practical and yet most profound item was the passport. Seeing my own face staring back at me from the stiff, official paper was jarring. The man in the photo looked 10 years younger and 1,000 years lighter. He had no knowledge of the silence that was to come. He was smiling, a faint, confident quirk of the lips. Eleanor had chosen the photo. Of course she had. It was a reminder of who I was before grief had hollowed me out, a promise of who I could be again. A plan without action is just a dream. My first action was small, almost laughably so, but it felt like a declaration of intent. I went to the post office in the next town over and rented a private mailbox. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, slid the small key across the counter. It felt solid and real in my palm. This was my new channel to the world, a line of communication that was mine alone. All correspondence regarding my new life would come here, to this anonymous box in a town where no one knew my name. It was the first brick in my new foundation. Next, I needed legal counsel. Eleanor's note had been specific on this point. "Do not use Jonathan," she had written, referring to the family lawyer we had used for decades, a man who played golf with Michael every other Saturday. "He's a good man, but his loyalties are complicated." Instead, she had provided a name and a number for a man named Alastair Finch. The note beside his name was simple. "He understands difficult families. He drinks Earl Grey and does not play golf." I called him from a pay-as-you-go phone I bought at a corner shop, another small act of creating operational distance. His voice was exactly as I had imagined, dry, precise, and unhurried. I explained that I was a recent widower seeking advice on estate matters. I gave him the P.O. Box as my mailing address. We scheduled a meeting for the following week at his office, a discreet set of rooms above a bookshop. In the meantime, the pressure from Michael and Clara intensified. They began a coordinated campaign, a pincer movement of feigned concern and practical advice. Clara would call in the mornings, her voice soft and full of therapeutic jargon. She spoke of processing my grief, of letting go of attachments, and the importance of moving into a new chapter. Her words were like smooth, polished stones, designed to be easy to swallow, but they sat heavy and indigestible in my stomach. She sent me links to articles about the psychological benefits of downsizing for seniors. She was trying to manage my emotions, to gently herd me toward the conclusion she and Michael had already reached. Michael's approach was less subtle. He would call in the evenings, his voice booming with a false heartiness. He talked about logistics, market trends, and capital gains tax. He had already spoken to real estate agents, to movers, to condo managers. He presented the sale of the house as a foregone conclusion, a complex project that he, as the dutiful son, was generously managing on my behalf. He emailed me spreadsheets with projected net returns and brochures for luxury retirement communities that looked more like sterile hotels than homes. One evening, I used one of the glossy brochures to level the wobbly leg of the kitchen table. It was a small, petty act of defiance, but it brought me a surprising amount of satisfaction. They worked as a team, one appealing to my heart, the other to my head. But they were both aiming for the same thing, my wallet. And they both fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my grief. They saw it as a problem to be solved, a temporary state of incapacity from which I needed to be rescued. They did not see that my grief was inextricably linked to my love for Eleanor, and that this house, this garden, this life we had built was the physical embodiment of that love. To sell, it was not just a financial transaction. It was an act of erasure. And I would not allow it. My meeting with Alastair Finch was a quiet revelation. His office was lined with books, not the matching decorative sets one often sees, but a sprawling, chaotic collection that had clearly been read and reread. The air smelled of old paper and Earl Grey tea, just as Eleanor had promised. Mr. Finch himself was a tall, stooped man with kind, intelligent eyes behind thick spectacles. He listened without interruption as I laid out the situation, my voice low and steady. I told him about Eleanor's death, about my children's insistence on selling the house, and about my desire to remain. I did not, however, tell him about the folder. Not yet. That was my ace, and a good card player never shows his hand too early. I needed to see if he was the man Eleanor believed him to be. When I had finished, he steepled his long, thin fingers and looked at me over his glasses. "Grief is poor soil for major life decisions. Mr. Miller," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Your children, with the best of intentions, I am sure, are attempting to rush the harvest." The gardening metaphor was not lost on me. I felt a flicker of trust. "They are persistent," I said. "Persistence is often the camouflage of self-interest," he replied with a wry smile. "Legally, your position is quite simple. Assuming the house is in your name, you're under no obligation to sell it, discuss selling it, or even entertain the notion of selling it. Your children's wishes are, from a legal standpoint, entirely irrelevant. They've mentioned my best interests. There was a veiled thread of questioning my competence, my ability to manage my own affairs, I admitted, the words tasting like poison. Alastair Finch's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Ah, the final refuge of the greedy child, the competency hearing. It is an ugly, brutish tool, and judges are not fond of it, especially when it is so transparently wielded for financial gain. Are you of sound mind, Mr. Miller? I believe so, I said. You manage your own finances? You pay your bills? You have not, for instance, started communicating exclusively in limericks or bequeathing your estate to a society of particularly intelligent squirrels. A small, dry laugh escaped me. It was the first time I'd laughed in weeks. No, nothing of the sort. Then they have no case. It would be a nasty, expensive, and ultimately futile exercise in familial cruelty. However, we could take steps to make that abundantly clear to them. He outlined a simple, elegant strategy. He would draft a letter to be sent from his office to both Michael and Clara. The letter would state, in no uncertain terms, that I had retained him as my legal counsel, that I was of sound mind and firm in my decision not to sell my home, and that any future communication regarding my property or finances was to be directed exclusively to him. We are building a wall, Mr. Miller, he explained. A polite, professional, and legally impermeable wall. It will sever their direct line of emotional leverage. They will be forced to communicate through me, which will remove the personal pressure and force them to contend with the legal realities rather than your perceived emotional state. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of quiet, decisive action the moment required. And one more thing, he said, leaning forward slightly. We will also send a notice of non-representation to Jonathan, a professional courtesy, informing him that we are now handling your affairs. It will prevent any informal back-channel conversations over a round of golf. Eleanor had been right. He understood. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. I had an ally. The path ahead was still shrouded in mist, but now I had a compass and a guide. That afternoon, I sat at Eleanor's desk and took out a piece of her good stationery, the thick, cream-colored paper she reserved for important correspondence. I took the pay-as-you-go phone and, with a hand that trembled only slightly, I dialed the international number for Sofia in Portugal. It rang 4 times, each ring a thunderclap in the silent room. I was about to hang up when a woman's voice answered, warm and clear, with a musical Portuguese accent. Estou. Hello, I stammered. My name is Arthur Miller. I'm calling for Sofia. There was a pause. This is Sofia. Arthur. Eleanor's Arthur. Yes. I breathed, a wave of relief washing over me. Ah, she said, her voice softening with a deep, knowing sadness. I'm so very sorry for your loss, Arthur. She was a magnificent woman. I have been waiting for your call. The simple kindness in her voice, the acknowledgement of Eleanor's magnificence from a stranger thousands of miles away, broke through my carefully constructed composure. My eyes welled up. She told you I would call? Of course. She told me everything. She said, Sofia, one day a lovely, stubborn Englishman will call you. He will sound a little lost. Please, help him find his way. Her voice held a gentle amusement, a shared memory of my wife's affectionate exasperation with me. She left me instructions, I said, my voice thick. I know, she replied, and I have my own. The house is ready, Arthur. It has been ready for a long time. The walls are newly painted. The linens are fresh. I aired it out just last week. The lemon trees in the garden are heavy with fruit. It is waiting for you. The abstract idea of a house on a cliffside suddenly became a tangible reality. It was not just a deed in a folder. It was a place with fresh linens and lemon trees. A place that was waiting for me. We spoke for nearly an hour. Sofia told me about her friendship with Eleanor, a bond forged during a solo trip my wife had taken years ago, a trip I had encouraged her to take while I was recovering from a minor surgery. She had fallen in love with the village and, with Sofia's help, had found the small, slightly neglected house and bought it. Over the years, she had returned several times, overseeing its restoration, planting the garden, turning it into a secret sanctuary. It was a project she had undertaken with the same quiet determination she brought to everything. She called it her just-in-case house, Sophia said softly. Just in case the world became too loud. Just in case you needed a quiet place to land. The world had become too loud, and I needed a quiet place to land. When you are ready, Arthur, Sophia said before we hung up, you just come. I will be here. I put the phone down, my hand resting on the receiver. The conversation had solidified my resolve. This was not just about defending myself from my children. It was about honoring my wife's last, greatest act of love. It was about stepping into the future she had so carefully and secretly built for me. The next day, the letters from Alastair Finch's office were sent. A quiet, decisive volley. The first shot in a war I had not asked for, but one I was now fully prepared to fight. And win. The silence that followed the dispatch of Alastair Finch's letters was of a different quality altogether. It was not the hollow silence of grief, nor the charged silence of a held breath. It was a tactical silence, the quiet that descends on a chessboard after a significant move has been made. I found myself waiting, not with anxiety, but with a kind of detached curiosity to see how my opponents would respond. I spent the time productively, methodically. I was a man preparing for a journey, both internal and external. My first order of business was the garden. For weeks, I had only been able to look at it through the kitchen window, a painful diorama of Eleanor's absence. Now, I forced myself to open the back door, the scent of damp earth and overgrown rosemary rushing in to greet me. I put on her old gardening gloves, which were still on the shelf by the door. They were too small for my hands, but I squeezed them on anyway, the worn leather still holding the shape of her fingers. It felt like holding her hand one last time. Gardening is an act of faith. You bury a dormant bulb in the cold, dark earth, trusting that it will, in its own time, find its way to the light. My work in the garden became a metaphor for my own life. I started with the weeds. They had taken advantage of the neglect, their insidious roots choking the life from the perennials Eleanor had so lovingly planted. I spent a full day on my hands and knees, pulling them out one by one. It was hard, satisfying work. With every weed I pulled, I felt as though I were clearing a space in my own mind, removing the choking thoughts of resentment and despair that had taken root there. I was not just weeding the garden, I was weeding my soul. I pruned the roses, cutting back the dead wood to allow for new growth. It was a brutal, necessary act. Eleanor had taught me that a rose bush that is not pruned becomes a tangled, unproductive mess. You have to be ruthless, she would say, for the sake of the plant. You have to cut away the parts that are no longer serving the whole. The symbolism was not lost on me. I was in my own way, pruning my life, cutting away the relationships that had become tangled and were draining my energy, all for the sake of future growth. As I worked, memories of Eleanor in this garden came back to me, not with the sharp sting of fresh grief, but with a gentle, melancholic warmth. I could see her kneeling where I was kneeling, her face smudged with dirt, a contented smile on her lips. I could hear her voice explaining the difference between a weed and a wildflower, her philosophy that even the most unwanted things could have a certain beauty if you looked at them in the right light. This garden was her testament, a living library of her wisdom and patience. And by tending it, I was keeping her memory, her very essence, alive. The response from my children, when it came, was not directed at me. It was a furious, sputtering volley aimed at the wall I had built. Alastair Finch called me a few days later. "We seem to have stirred the hornet's nest," he said, a note of dry amusement in his voice. "I've received a rather emotional call from your son, and a lengthy, rambling email from your daughter. And," I asked, clipping a stray branch from the wisteria, "your son accused me of being an unscrupulous opportunist who was taking advantage of a grieving old man. He threatened to report me to the Bar Association. Your daughter's email was a masterclass in passive aggression, questioning my ethics and expressing her deep concern that I was isolating you from your loving family during your time of need." "So, the usual then," I said. "Precisely. They are flailing, Mr. Miller. They have lost their direct line of influence, and they're not accustomed to it. They tried to bully and to guilt, and when both failed, they resorted to empty threats. I have, of course, responded to them both with a polite, brief letter reiterating our position and reminding them of the legal definition of harassment. He paused. I believe their next move will be to attempt to circumvent me and contact you directly. I would advise you not to answer their calls. Let everything go to voicemail. We must maintain the integrity of the wall. His advice was sound. The next day, the calls began. Michael, Clara, Michael again. I watched the phone light up, their names flashing on the screen, and I did not move. I let the calls ring out, each one a futile assault on my newfound peace. Later, I listened to the voicemails. Michael's was a torrent of barely controlled rage, full of accusations and demands. Clara's was worse. Her voice was thick with tears, whether real or manufactured. I could not tell, as she pleaded with me to call her, to not let this lawyer come between us, to remember that we were family. It was emotional blackmail of the highest order, and the old me, the me of a month ago, would have crumbled. I would have been consumed by guilt, by the desperate need to keep the peace, to smooth over the cracks in our fractured family. But the man who listened to those messages was a different man. He was a man who had spent the day on his knees in the dirt, tending his late wife's garden. He was a man who understood the necessity of pruning. I deleted the messages without a reply. It was time for the next step in my quiet offensive. It was an idea that had been germinating in my mind for days, a plan that was both symbolic and intensely practical. It was, I thought, something Eleanor would have appreciated for its elegant, non-confrontational brutality. The attic and the basement of our house were museums of our children's past. They were filled with the detritus of two lives, things they had been unwilling to throw away, but unwilling to make space for in their own, carefully curated homes. There were boxes of childhood artwork, towering stacks of school reports and participation trophies, old sports equipment, outgrown clothes, broken toys, university textbooks. For years, this house had served as their free, long-term storage unit. They had offloaded their pasts onto us, expecting us to be the permanent curators of their nostalgia. I decided it was time to return their property. I hired a moving company, a small, local firm run by two brothers with strong backs and discreet dispositions. I didn't tell them the whole story, of course. I simply said that I was clearing out the attic and basement and wanted to send some things to my children. The process of sorting was a strange, archaeological dig through the layers of my children's lives, and by extension, my own. I unearthed crayon drawings from kindergarten, a science fair project on volcanoes that had ruined a good tablecloth, Clara's ballet slippers, Michael's first baseball glove. Each object was a ghost, a memory of the children they had once been, the children I had loved so fiercely and whose current incarnations I was struggling to understand. There was a pang of sadness in it, an acknowledgement of the great, unbridgeable distance between then and now. Where did that little boy who drew a lopsided picture of our family go? When did that little girl who dreamed of being a ballerina become a woman who spoke of her father's home in terms of market value? I packed it all, the good memories and the bad, the triumphs and the failures. I did not linger. To linger would be to fall back into the trap of sentimentality, and sentimentality was a luxury I could not afford. This was a tactical operation, not a trip down memory lane. I packed everything into sturdy cardboard boxes, labeling each one clearly. Michael's belongings or Clara's belongings, I was meticulous. Every last forgotten artifact of their youth was boxed up. By the time I was done, there were 37 boxes in total, a small mountain of curated history. The movers arrived on a Tuesday morning. They were efficient and professional, loading the boxes onto their truck with practiced ease. I gave them the addresses and paid them in cash. Should we have them call first? One of the brothers asked. No, I said. I'd like it to be a surprise. I watched the truck pull away from the curb, a deep sense of finality settling over me. I had returned their baggage to them, both literally and figuratively. I had cleared out the physical space they occupied in my home, and in doing so, I had cleared out a corresponding space in my head. The house felt lighter, emptier, but it was a clean, healthy emptiness. It was the emptiness of a prepared field, waiting for new seeds to be sown. I spent the rest of the day in the kitchen, another of Eleanor's sacred spaces. Cooking, like gardening, had become a form of therapy for me. The methodical chopping of vegetables, the patient stirring of a sauce, the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into something nourishing. It was a way of imposing order on a chaotic world. I decided to make one of Eleanor's recipes, a slow-cooked beef stew that required hours of gentle simmering. It was a dish she made on cold, rainy days, and always filled the house with a rich, comforting aroma. As I browned the meat and chopped the onions, I could almost feel her presence beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her voice in my ear, reminding me not to rush, to let the flavors develop in their own time. Patience is not the ability to wait, but the ability to keep a good attitude while waiting. Eleanor had taught me that. My plan, like this stew, required patience. It required a slow, gentle heat. The ingredients were all in the pot. Now all I had to do was wait for the flavors to meld, for the tough, grisly emotions to break down and become tender. The fallout from the delivery of the boxes was, as I had anticipated, swift and spectacular. The first call came from Clara. Her voice was an octave higher than usual, a thin, reedy sound of pure disbelief. "Dad? Dad, a moving truck just showed up at my house. They've unloaded boxes. 20 boxes. What is this? What is going on?" I was sitting in an armchair by the window, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The stew was simmering on the stove, its aroma a comforting shield against the coming storm. "Hello, Clara," I said, my voice even in calm. "Those are your things, from the attic and the basement. I thought you might want them." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing a ragged, incredulous sound. "My things? Dad, this is my entire childhood. My report cards? My Cabbage Patch doll? Why would you do this?" "I'm clearing out the house," I said simply. "Making some space." "Making space? What does that mean? Are you selling the house behind our backs? Is that what this is about? Is this that lawyer's idea?" The questions came in a frantic rush, a torrent of suspicion and panic. "No, Clara, I'm not selling the house. I'm just tidying up. The boxes belong to you, so I sent them to you." It seemed the logical thing to do. "Logical?" she shrieked. "There is nothing logical about this. This is hostile. It's a message, isn't it?" She was right, of course. It was a message. The message was, this house is no longer your storage facility. This house is mine. But I did not say that. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said. "I really must go now. The stew is about to boil over." And I hung up the phone. Michael's call came 10 minutes later. It was not a call. It was a detonation. "What the hell is this?" he roared, without any preamble. 17 boxes of junk just got dumped on my driveway. My wife is asking me, what's going on? "What do you think you're doing?" "Hello, Michael. I'm returning your property," I said, using the same calm, measured tone. "My property? This is junk. My old tennis rackets? A box of comic books? This is insane. You've gone completely mad. I knew it. That lawyer is poisoning your mind." I let him shout. His anger was a wildfire, consuming everything in its path, but I was safely on the other side of a firebreak. His rage had no purchase on me anymore. It was just noise, the sound of a man who had lost control and was furious about it. "The comic books might be valuable," I said mildly. "You should get them appraised." This seemed to enrage him further. "This isn't about comic books, and you know it. This is a power play. You're trying to cut US out." "I'm tidying up, Michael," I repeated. "As for cutting you out, you seem to be doing a fine job of that yourself. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have things to do. Don't you hang up on me, old man. We are coming over. We are going to sort this out, right now." "That would not be a good idea," I said, my voice dropping a little, losing its placid edge and taking on a hint of steel. "I'm not receiving visitors today. Goodbye, Michael." I disconnected the call, and then, for good measure, I unplugged the phone from the wall. The sudden, absolute silence was a balm. I walked to the stove and lifted the lid from the pot. The rich, dark stew bubbled gently. It smelled of home, of warmth, of sanity. I had returned their past to them. Now, they would have to decide what to do with it. They could either cherish it, or they could throw it away. The choice was theirs, but it would no longer be cluttering up my house, or my life. Some victories are loud. Mine would not be. Mine would be the quiet satisfaction of a well-tended garden, the comforting aroma of a slow-cooked meal, and the profound, unshakable peace of a disconnected phone. The unplugged phone sat on the hall table, a silent black monument to my small act of rebellion. The house was quiet again, but it was a chosen quiet, an intentional peace. I ate my stew in the dining room, at the large mahogany table that had hosted decades of family meals, of laughter and arguments, of celebrations and sorrows. Eating alone at that table had, in the first weeks, been an act of profound loneliness. Tonight, it felt different. It felt like an act of reclamation. I was taking back my space, my time, my life. I was the sole occupant of this house and the master of its quiet. I knew, of course, that this was not the end of it. Michael's threat to come over was not an idle one. They would not be so easily deterred. They would see my actions not as a bid for autonomy, but as a confirmation of their worst fears, that their father was losing his mind, that he was being manipulated, and that their inheritance was in jeopardy. Their next move would be to force a confrontation. They would try to breach the wall I had so carefully constructed, and I would have to be ready for them. Preparation is the better part of valor. Eleanor had a cross-stitch sampler with that phrase hanging in her sewing room. I had always thought it was a bit quaint. Now I understood its wisdom. I spent the next 2 days preparing, not for a battle, but for a meeting, a controlled, carefully managed negotiation in which I would hold all the cards. First, I called Alistair Finch. I told him about the boxes and about the subsequent phone calls. He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound like autumn leaves. A bold move, Mr. Miller. Poetic even. You have forced their hand. They will almost certainly demand a face-to-face meeting now. They will want to see you, to gauge your state of mind for themselves, to try to reestablish their emotional leverage. I expect so, I said. My advice, he continued, is to grant them this meeting, but must be on our terms, at your house, at a time of your choosing, and I will be present. My presence will change the dynamic from a family argument to a legal consultation. It will force them to be on their best behavior. We agreed on a time, Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock. This gave me 2 days to prepare the stage. Next, I delved back into Eleanor's manila folder. Thus far, I had kept its contents a secret, even from Mr. Finch. I had used him to build the outer defenses, but the core of my strategy, the true source of my independence, remained my own. Now it was time to bring my counsel fully into my confidence. I gathered the deed, the bank statements, and Eleanor's letter, and I made an appointment to see him the day before the meeting with my children. My final preparation was more personal. It involved my granddaughter, Lily. Lily was Clara's daughter, but in spirit, she was Eleanor's. She was a quiet, observant, artistic soul who had inherited her grandmother's wisdom and none of her mother's transactional nature. She was 20 years old, studying art history at the university, and she had been a constant, gentle source of comfort to me since Eleanor's death. She would call just to check in, not to ask for anything or to offer unsolicited advice, but simply to talk. She would tell me about her classes, about a painting she had seen, about a funny thing that had happened on the bus. She was the one member of my family with whom I could still have a normal conversation. I knew that Michael and Clara had been feeding her their own narrative about my situation. They would have told her they were worried about me, that I was being difficult. I needed to speak to her, to give her my side of the story, or at least a part of it. But more than that, I needed to set a small, crucial piece of my plan in motion. I called her. Her voice was a welcome relief, warm and genuine. "Grandpa, how are you?" "I'm doing all right, my dear," I said. "I was just thinking about you, and about your grandmother." "I think about her all the time," she said softly. "I know you do. Listen, Lily, I have a rather strange question for you. Do you remember, a few years ago, when your grandmother gave you some money for your art trip to Florence?" There was a pause. "The trip I never took. That's the one. She was so insistent that you go. She set aside some money specifically for it. 5,000 euros, I believe it was. Did your parents ever pass that along to you? The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. I had my answer before she even spoke. No, she said finally, her voice small. No, they didn't. Mom said, she said things were a bit tight, and that Grandma had just been talking that there wasn't any actual money set aside. She said we could use my college fund for a trip after I graduated. The casual, cruel deception of it took my breath away. They had stolen from their own daughter, using Eleanor's generosity as a cover. I closed my eyes, a cold, hard anger solidifying in my chest. It was not a hot, explosive anger like Michael's, but a slow-burning, clarifying rage. I see, I said, keeping my voice level. Well, your grandmother was nothing if not meticulous. She kept records of everything. I have the bank transfer statement right here in front of me. The money was transferred to your mother's account 3 years ago, with a note for Lily's Florence trip in the memo line. I could hear a sharp intake of breath. Oh, yes. Oh, Lily, my dear, I don't want you to do anything about this right now. I don't want you to confront them. But I needed you to know the truth. And I may need you to confirm that you never received that money at some point in the near future. Would you be willing to do that? Of course, Grandpa, she said, her voice trembling slightly, not with sadness, but with a nascent anger of her own. Of course I will. Thank you, my dear. That's all I need for now. We'll talk again soon. I hung up the phone. The final piece was in place. It was a nasty, ugly piece of business, and I took no joy in using my granddaughter's stolen inheritance as a weapon. But my children had chosen the battlefield. I was simply choosing the ammunition, and mine, I reflected, was far more potent than theirs. Theirs was based on lies and assumptions. Mine was based on the truth, meticulously documented in Eleanor's elegant, sloping hand. The day I showed Alastair Finch the contents of the manila folder was a day I will not soon forget. We sat in his book-lined office, the scent of Earl Grey tea hanging in the air. I laid the documents out on his desk, the deed, the bank statements, the passport, the letter. He picked up each one, his eyes scanning the pages with a practiced, professional speed. He read Eleanor's letter twice. When he was finished, he took off his glasses and polished them slowly with a handkerchief. He looked at me, and his customary professional reserve was gone, replaced by a look of profound, undisguised admiration. My word, Mr. Miller, he said softly. Your wife was a truly remarkable woman. This is not just prudent estate planning. This is a masterpiece, a symphony of foresight and love. She was, I said, my voice thick with emotion. This changes everything, he said, his legal mind already working, fitting the new pieces into the puzzle. We are no longer on the defensive. We are not just protecting your right to stay in your home. We are affirming your absolute and total financial and personal autonomy. They have no leverage. None. They think they are negotiating over a valuable asset, but the asset they truly want, control over you and your finances, has already been moved off the board. He looked at me, a shrewd glint in his eye. The meeting on Friday has just become a great deal more interesting. We will not reveal this. Not at first. We will let them make their case. We will let them posture and threaten. And then, at the opportune moment, we will inform them that their concerns for your financial well-being are, while touching, entirely unnecessary. A slow smile spread across my face. I have one more piece of ammunition, I said, and I told them about Lily and the 5,000 euros. Alastair Finch listened, his expression unreadable. When I was done, he simply nodded. Cruelty and greed are often bedfellows, he said quietly. Yes, we will use that, not as a legal tool, but as a moral one. It will be the checkmate. On Friday morning, I prepare the house. I did not prepare it for a battle, but for a tea party. I cleaned and polished every surface until the wood gleamed. I bought fresh flowers, white lilies for Lily and for the purity of my purpose, and arranged them in a vase on the dining table. I went into the garden and cut a few sprigs of rosemary, which I placed in a small bud vase on the mantelpiece, a quiet tribute to Eleanor. Then I baked. I made Eleanor's signature lemon drizzle cake. The familiar ritual of measuring the flour, zesting the lemons, Beating the eggs and sugar together until they were light and pale was a meditation. The sweet, sharp scent of baking lemons filled the house, a fragrant armor against the impending unpleasantness. By the time the doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock, I was calm. I was ready. The house was my stage, and the performance was about to begin. I opened the door to find Michael and Clara standing on the porch. They looked like a delegation from a hostile nation, dressed in severe, businesslike attire, their faces set in grim, determined lines. They had come for a battle, and my tranquil, flower-filled, cake-scented house was clearly not the battlefield they had been expecting. It threw them off balance before they had even stepped inside. "Dad," Michael said, his voice a low rumble. He tried to step past me, to take control of the space, but I stood my ground. "Michael, Clara, please come in," I said, my tone polite and welcoming, as if they were ordinary guests who had dropped by for a social call. Alastair Finch was already seated in the living room, in the armchair opposite the fireplace. His presence was a quiet, immovable fact. He rose as they entered, a tall, slightly stooped figure of academic authority. "Michael, Clara, this is my legal counsel, Mr. Alastair Finch," I said. "Mr. Finch, my children, Michael and Clara." They shook his hand reluctantly, their eyes darting around the room, taking in the scene. The fresh flowers, the gleaming furniture, the calm, quiet man in the armchair. This was not the home of a grieving, incompetent old man on the verge of a breakdown. This was the home of someone who was in complete control. "A lawyer," Clara said, her voice laced with manufactured hurt. "Dad, I can't believe you'd have a lawyer here. This is a family matter." "On the contrary," Alastair Finch said smoothly, gesturing for them to sit on the sofa. "Given the nature of the correspondence I have received from you both, it has become abundantly clear that this is, in fact, a legal matter. Please have a seat. Mr. Miller has made tea." I went to the kitchen and returned with a tray. On it was Eleanor's best china tea set, the one we only used for special occasions. It was decorated with tiny, hand-painted violets. I also brought out the lemon drizzle cake, sliced and arranged on a platter. The sheer, unassailable civility of the act was a weapon in itself. They wanted to fight. I was offering them cake. I poured the tea. They accepted their cups with stiff, awkward movements. They did not touch the cake. "So," Michael began, placing his cup down with a sharp clatter. He dispensed with any pretense of concern. "Let's cut to the chase. Dad, what's going on? First, you hire this gentleman. Then you send us all our childhood junk. You won't answer our calls. You're not acting like yourself. We're worried, deeply worried." "I am grieving, Michael," I said quietly, "but my mind is my own. I have been tidying up, returning things to their rightful owners, establishing boundaries. It seems to me a perfectly rational course of action." "Rational?" Clara chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Dad, it's not rational to be living in this huge house all by yourself. The upkeep, the stairs, the garden, it's a burden. We found a lovely place for you. It has a waiting list, but Michael pulled some strings. I'm not interested in a lovely place," I said, my voice firm but quiet. "This is my home. Your mother and I built a life here. I have no intention of leaving. It's not about intention, it's about capacity." Michael's voice was rising, his frustration beginning to boil over. "You're not thinking clearly. You're emotional. You need someone to look after your best interests, and right now, that's us." And there it was. The word. Capacity, the veiled threat made plain. Alastair Finch cleared his throat softly. All eyes turned to him. "If I may," he said, his voice calm and academic. "The question of your father's capacity is a legal one, not a matter for familial opinion. And I can assure you, having spent a considerable amount of time with Mr. Miller, that he is in full command of his faculties. Any attempt to suggest otherwise in a legal forum would be ill-advised, and frankly, quite embarrassing for you." Michael's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "This is none of your business. This is about family. When you threaten to challenge a man's legal autonomy, it becomes my business," Mr. Finch replied coolly. "Now, Let us move on from these baseless and offensive insinuations. You're concerned about your father's financial well-being, is that correct? You believe that the sale of this house is essential to secure his future. Of course, Clara said. He's living on a pension. This house is his nest egg. We're just trying to be responsible. I see. Mr. Finch leaned back in his chair. He looked at me and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Your concern for my financial welfare is touching, I said, looking from my son to my daughter. But it is entirely unnecessary. Your mother, being the wise and prudent woman she was, made extensive arrangements for me. My future is quite secure without any need to sell this house. They stared at me, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. What arrangements? Michael demanded. What are you talking about? I did not answer. Instead, I looked to Mr. Finch. Mr. Miller is the beneficiary of a number of assets and accounts of which you were not previously aware, he stated, his tone flat and factual. These assets are more than sufficient to provide for his comfort and care for the remainder of his life. The disposition of this house, therefore, is not a matter of financial necessity. It is a matter of your father's personal choice, and he has made his choice. The silence in the room was thick with thwarted ambition. I could almost hear the sound of their mental calculations, the frantic recalibration of their plans. They had built their entire strategy on the assumption of my financial vulnerability. We had just dynamited that foundation. Assets? What assets? Clara whispered, her eyes wide. That, I said, is a private matter. They were reeling, but not yet defeated. Greed is a tenacious beast. Michael, ever the fighter, regrouped. Fine, he snapped. Fine. So you have some secret money. That doesn't change the fact that this house is too much for you. It's still a burden. And it's our family home. It's our inheritance. We have a right to have a say in what happens to it. You have no such right, Mr. Finch interjected calmly. Not legally. And, if you'll permit me to say so, you seem to have a rather tenuous grasp on the moral right as well. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Which brings me to another matter. A smaller, but perhaps more illuminating, financial issue. He looked at me. It was time for the checkmate. I picked up my mobile phone from the table beside me. My hand was perfectly steady. I found Lily's number in my contacts and pressed the call button. I put the phone on speaker and placed it in the center of the coffee table. It rang once, twice. Grandpa, Lily's clear voice filled the room. Michael and Clara looked at the phone, then at me, their faces a mask of confusion. Hello, my dear, I said. I'm sorry to bother you. I have your mother and your uncle here with me, and we were just having a little chat about family finances. I have a quick question for you, if you don't mind. Of course, Grandpa. Lily, a few years ago, your grandmother Eleanor transferred 5,000 euros to your mother's bank account. The money was a gift to you, specifically for an art history trip to Florence. I just wanted to confirm for everyone here. Did you ever receive that money? The silence that followed was the most profound I have ever experienced. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and all the bluster out of the room. Michael and Clara were frozen, their faces pale with shock. They looked like statues, caught in the moment of their unmasking. No, Grandpa. Lily's voice was quiet, but it carried the devastating weight of truth. I never did. Mom told me Grandma had just been talking, that there was no actual money. I looked at Clara. Her teacup was rattling in its saucer, her hand trembling uncontrollably. She couldn't meet my eyes. Michael was staring at his sister, his mouth slightly agape, a look of dawning horror and disgust on his face. He was greedy, yes, but I don't think he had ever imagined his sister was a common thief, especially not from her own daughter. Thank you, Lily, I said gently. That's all I needed to know. We'll talk later. I disconnected the call and placed the phone back on the table. I looked at my children. Their moral authority had not just been challenged. It had been utterly vaporized. They had come to my house to question my competence, to lecture me on responsibility, to take control of my life for my own good. And in the space of 30 seconds, they had been exposed as liars and thieves in the presence of a lawyer and their own father. There was nothing left to say. The argument was over. The war was won. I stood up. "I believe this meeting is concluded," I said, my voice devoid of anger or triumph. It was simply a statement of fact. "Mr. Finch will show you out." They left without another word, without making eye contact, without touching the lemon drizzle cake. They were two separate people now, not a team. The bond of their shared ambition had been broken by the revelation of their separate, sordid betrayals. After they were gone, Alastair Finch and I sat in silence for a few moments. The only sound were the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. "Well," he said finally, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, "I do believe that qualifies as a checkmate." "Thank you, Alastair," I said, "for everything." "It was my privilege, Arthur," he replied. He stood to leave, pausing at the door. "Your wife would have been very, very proud of you today." His words were the only victory speech I needed. After he left, I walked through my quiet, peaceful house. I went to the mantelpiece and picked up the sprig of rosemary. I crushed a few of its needles between my fingers and inhaled the sharp, clean scent. It was the scent of memory, the scent of remembrance. And today, for the first time in a long time, it was also the scent of freedom. The days following the confrontation settled into a new kind of quiet. It was the quiet of resolution. The calm after a storm has passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. There are no more phone calls, no more emails, no more glossy brochures for retirement homes appearing in my mailbox. The wall Alastair Finch had helped me build had held, and the assault had ceased. I had expected to feel a sense of triumph, a surge of vindication. Instead, what I felt was a profound and weary peace. I had not enjoyed the battle. I had not relished exposing my children's flaws. I had simply done what was necessary to protect myself and to honor Eleanor. My life, once again, took on the rhythm of the garden. I spent my mornings outdoors, my hands in the soil, tending to the things that grew, the things that responded to care with beauty. I found a deep satisfaction in the simple, honest work of it. A plant does not lie to you. It does not try to manipulate you. It either thrives or it withers in direct response to the conditions you provide. It was a relationship I could understand, a partnership based on clear and simple truths. In the afternoons, I began the slow, deliberate process of sorting through the house. Not with the frantic energy of a man preparing to be sold out of his home, but with the careful, curatorial touch of a man setting his legacy in order. The removal of my children's belongings had been the first, brutal step. Now came the more nuanced work of deciding what to keep, what to discard, and what to pass on. I went through Eleanor's clothes. This was the hardest task of all. Each dress, each scarf, each pair of shoes held a memory. I could see her in the blue linen dress she wore to our 25th anniversary party. I could feel the soft wool of the sweater she always wore when she read by the fire. I could smell her perfume on the collar of her favorite coat. For 2 days, I did nothing but open her closets and drawers, touch the fabrics, and allow the memories to wash over me. It was a necessary baptism of sorrow. Then, on the 3rd day, I began to pack. I chose a few of her most iconic pieces: the blue dress, a silk scarf with a pattern of hummingbirds, her gardening hat, and packed them carefully in a cedar chest for Lily. The rest, I donated to a charity that provided professional clothing for women in need. I imagined her well-made suits and sensible blouses finding new life, empowering other women. It felt like the right thing to do. It felt like something Eleanor herself would have done. As I worked my way through the house, I began to see it not just as a repository of the past, but as a vessel for the future. I was no longer just its occupant. I was its steward. My focus began to shift from the past to the future, from what I had lost to what I could create. And the image of the small, whitewashed house on the cliffs of Portugal began to occupy more and more of my thoughts. It was no longer just an escape plan, a just-in-case house. It was becoming a destination, a possibility, a new chapter waiting to be written. I spoke to Sophia once a week on my pay-as-you-go phone. Our conversations were a lifeline to that potential future. She told me about the village, about the rhythm of life dictated by the tides and the seasons. She told me about the local market, the fishermen who brought in their catch each morning, the old woman who sold bread baked in a wood-fired oven. She described the light, the salty air, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below the house. She was painting a picture for me, and I was slowly, carefully beginning to paint myself into it. One afternoon, she asked me a simple question that crystallized everything. "So, Arthur," she said, her voice warm and direct, "when are you coming?" The question hung in the air. It was not an invitation. It was an expectation. It assumed my arrival was a certainty, that the only variable was time. And in that moment, I realized she was right. My life here, in this house, full of ghosts and memories, was over. I had defended it. I had secured it. But I no longer needed to live in it. My work here was done. The house had been a fortress, and it had served its purpose. But one does not live in a fortress forever. Sooner or later, you have to step outside the walls and into the sunlight. "Soon," I said, and the word felt true and right on my tongue. "I'm coming soon." The decision, once made, brought with it a cascade of logistical details, but they felt manageable, exciting even. This was not the panicked, forced downsizing my children had envisioned for me. This was a deliberate, joyful migration. I met with Alastair Finch again. I finally told him the full extent of my plan, showing him the pictures of the house in Azenias du Mar, telling him about Sophia and the life that was waiting for me. He listened with his customary quiet attentiveness. "A bold and wonderful plan," he said when I had finished. "A new beginning. So, what do you wish to do with this house?" The fortress. This was the final piece of the puzzle. What would become of this place, this vessel of so much of my life? Selling it was still out of the question. I would not give Michael and Clara the satisfaction. And besides, it felt like a betrayal of Eleanor. This house was more than just bricks and mortar, more than just an asset on a balance sheet. It was a living thing, saturated with love and memory. "I want to preserve it," I said, "but not as a museum. I want it to be used. I want it to be a place of creation, of quiet contemplation." Together, Alastair and I devised a plan. We would create a trust. The house and a portion of my remaining assets would be placed into it. The trust would be administered by a board, with a very specific mandate, to maintain the house and garden, and to make it available as a short-term residence for artists, writers, and scholars. A place for people to come and work in peace, to draw inspiration from the quiet beauty of the house and the garden that Eleanor had created. A kind of secular monastery for the creative soul. And the future trustee, the person who would one day oversee this small foundation. There was only one possible candidate. I invited Lily to lunch. We went to a small, quiet restaurant in the city, a place Eleanor and I had been fond of. I watched her as she talked about her studies, her passion for the hidden stories in art, for the way a single brushstroke could convey a world of emotion. She had her grandmother's eyes, full of intelligence and empathy. After we had eaten, I slid a large envelope across the table to her. "What's this, Grandpa?" she asked. "It's a proposal," I said. She opened it. Inside were the preliminary documents for the trust, the Eleanor Miller Foundation for the Creative Arts. There was a mission statement, a list of assets, and the proposed structure of the board. And at the bottom, under the heading Successor Trustee, was her name. She read it through, her eyes growing wider with each page. When she looked up at me, there were tears shimmering in her eyes. "Grandpa, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything yet," I told her. "It's a long way off. But I wanted you to know. This house, this legacy, it's not about money, Lily. It never was. It's about preserving a space for the things that truly matter. Beauty, quiet, creativity, the things your grandmother cherished. The things I know you cherish, too." "I do," she whispered. "More than anything." "I know," I said. "That's why it has to be you." Then I gave her a second envelope. This one was smaller, made of thick, cream-colored paper. On the front, in Eleanor's handwriting, was the single word, "Lily, your grandmother left this for you," I said. "I was meant to give it to you when the time was right. I believe that time is now." She held the letter as if it were a holy relic. She didn't open it. She just held it to her chest. "Thank you, Grandpa. Before I left, I had one last thing to do." I wrote two short, identical letters, one to Michael and one to Clara. The letters were brief and to the point. I am writing to inform you that I will be traveling abroad for an extended period. The house will be secured and maintained in my absence. My lawyer, Alistair Finch, will be managing my affairs. Any and all communication should be directed to him. I will be in touch in due course. I did not give them a destination. I did not give them a timeline. I gave them nothing but the bare, irreducible facts. I was leaving. I was in control. The discussion was over. I booked a one-way ticket to Lisbon. I packed 2 suitcases, one with clothes, the other with books, a few small tools from my workshop, and a framed photograph of Eleanor that sat at my bedside table. On a cool, clear morning in early autumn, I called a taxi. I took one last walk through the garden, my hand brushing against the rosemary bush. I stood in the living room and looked at the armchair where Eleanor had sat, at the faint indentation her body had left in the cushions. I did not feel sad. I felt a deep and abiding sense of gratitude. We had had a good life here, a complete life, and now it was time for a new one. I locked the front door behind me, the click of the tumbler sounding unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. I did not look back. The flight to Lisbon was a passage between worlds. As the plane climbed through the clouds, leaving the familiar green patchwork of the English countryside behind, I felt as though I were shedding an old skin. The man who had sat grieving in a silent house just a few months ago seemed like a distant relative, someone I had known a long time ago. The man on this plane was someone new. He was the co-conspirator in his late wife's greatest adventure. He was a man with a secret, a destination, and a purpose. The air that greeted me when I stepped out of the airport in Lisbon was different. It was softer, warmer, scented with salt and diesel and a faint, sweet smell of blooming flowers I couldn't identify. It was the air of a different life. Sophia was waiting for me just outside customs, exactly as she had described. She was a small, wiry woman in her late 60s, with a deeply tanned face, a cascade of unruly gray curls, and the brightest, most intelligent eyes I had ever seen. She held a small, hand-painted sign that said, simply, Arthur. She greeted me not with a handshake, but with a firm, warm hug. You are here, she said, as if confirming a long-held prophecy. You look tired. The journey is long. Come, we will go home. The word home sounded strange and yet perfectly natural. We drove out of the city in her small, battered car, heading west toward the coast. The landscape changed from urban sprawl to rolling hills dotted with vineyards and pine forests. Sophia drove with a focused, fearless intensity, all the while keeping up a steady stream of conversation. She pointed out landmarks, told me stories about the history of the region, and spoke of Eleanor with an easy, loving familiarity that filled my heart. She loved this road, Sophia said, as we turned onto a smaller, winding lane that led toward the sea. She said it was like driving toward the edge of the world. She had a poet's soul, your Eleanor. She did, I agreed, and a general's mind. Sophia laughed, a rich, throaty sound. That too, a perfect combination. She was a woman who could arrange flowers and plot a revolution in the same afternoon. The village of Zenhas do Mar appeared suddenly, a breathtaking cascade of white houses tumbling down the cliff face to a small, protected beach where the Atlantic waves crashed in a fury of white foam. It was even more beautiful than the pictures. It looked ancient, resilient, a place that had learned to live in harmony with the raw power of the ocean. Sophia navigated the impossibly narrow, cobbled streets with nonchalant expertise and pulled up in front of a simple, blue-painted door set into a high, whitewashed wall. Here we are, she said. Casa de Saudade. Eleanor called it that. The House of Longing. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. I stepped from a narrow street into a small, sun-drenched, walled garden. The air was filled with the intoxicating scent of lemons and salt and blooming jasmine. 3 gnarled lemon trees, heavy with bright yellow fruit, provided a dappled shade. Terracotta pots overflowed with vibrant geraniums and herbs. In the center, a small stone fountain trickled water, a cool, soothing sound. It was an oasis, a secret paradise hidden behind a simple blue door. The house itself was small and sturdy, its white walls thick and cool to the touch. Inside, it was simple, clean, and filled with light. The furniture was comfortable and unpretentious. There were bookshelves filled with books in English and Portuguese. On the wall were several of Eleanor's own watercolors, surprisingly skillful paintings of the local coastline. She had brought her soul here. She had infused this place with her essence. From the living room window, I could see the ocean. It was vast, powerful, and mesmerizing, a great, breathing expanse of blue and gray that stretched to the horizon. I could have stood there and watched it for a lifetime. "She did this for you, you know," Sophia said softly, coming to stand beside me. "All of it. She wanted you to have a place where you could hear your own thoughts again. A place where the sea was louder than the sadness." And in that moment, I understood the true depth of her gift. It was not the house, not the money, not even the escape from the demands of my children. It was this view, this quiet, this chance to simply be. The days that followed were a gentle unfolding. I learned the rhythms of the village. I learned to say "Bom dia" to my neighbors. I learned where to buy the best bread, the freshest fish, the sweetest oranges. I learned to sit at the small cafe in the square, drinking strong coffee and watching the world go by, feeling not like a tourist, but like a resident. Sophia was my guide, my friend, my connection to this new world. She introduced me to people, helped me navigate the small bureaucracies of setting up my new life, and shared meals with me in the lemon-scented garden. We spoke often of Eleanor, sharing stories, laughing at her quirks, marveling at her wisdom. Through Sophia, I came to know a side of my wife I had never seen, the independent, adventurous woman who had forged this secret life for herself and for me. My life became a series of simple, sensory pleasures. The taste of a sun-warmed tomato picked straight from a pot in the garden. The feeling of the cool sea breeze on my face as I walked along the cliffs. The sound of the church bells ringing in the evening. The satisfaction of repairing a loose hinge on a garden gate with my own hands. I was not just living. I was inhabiting my life fully and completely. I bought a new phone, a local Portuguese number. Only 2 people in the world had it, Sophia and Lily. I let my old life fall away. I did not need it anymore. I did not miss the constant, low-level hum of anxiety that had been its soundtrack for so long. Here, the only soundtrack was the sigh of the wind and the roar of the sea. One day, about a month after my arrival, a letter came, forwarded by Alistair Finch. It was from Lily. She wrote that she had read her grandmother's letter. She didn't tell me what it said, only that it was the greatest gift she had ever received. She told me that her mother and uncle were not speaking to each other or to her. She expressed no sadness about this, only a quiet resolve. She was planning her first trip to Florence, she said. She was finally going. She ended the letter with a simple sentence that brought tears to my eyes. "Grandma taught me what a legacy is, Grandpa, and you taught me how to fight for one foot." I folded the letter and put it in the drawer with Eleanor's. My wife had planted a garden, a beautiful, resilient garden, and I had tended it. I had pulled the weeds and pruned the deadwood. And now, the seeds she had sown were beginning to bloom in a new generation, in a new country, in a new life. My life in Azenhas do Mar took on a gentle, predictable shape, like a stone smoothed by the endless tide. My grief for Eleanor did not disappear, but it transformed. It was no longer a heavy cloak I was forced to wear, but a quiet, constant companion, a presence that reminded me of the depth of the love we had shared. I found myself talking to her as I worked in my small garden, my hands in the rich, dark soil. I would tell her about the spectacular sunset the night before, or about the funny old fisherman I had shared coffee with. It was a one-sided conversation, of course, but it felt real. It felt like a continuation of the dialogue we had been having for 50 years. I spent a lot of time with my hands. I found a small workshop space for rent at the edge of the village, and I filled it with old, second-hand tools. I started to work with wood again, a hobby I had let slide for years. I started with simple things, repairing a wobbly chair for Sophia, building some new shelf for my books, crafting a small, sturdy bench for the garden. The process was a meditation. The scent of sawdust, the satisfying curl of wood shaving coming off a plane, the slow transformation of a rough piece of timber into something smooth and useful. It was all deeply restorative. I was not just building things. I was rebuilding myself, one carefully measured cut at a time. My Portuguese improved slowly, haltingly. The villagers were patient and kind, correcting my grammar with gentle smiles, celebrating my small victories when I managed to string together a coherent sentence. I was the strange old Englishman in the Casa de Saudade, the man who had appeared from nowhere, but they accepted me into the fabric of their community. I was invited to local festivals, to family dinners, to late-night conversations over glasses of potent, home-brewed Madronho. I was no longer a foreigner. I was becoming a neighbor. 6 months after my arrival, Lily came to visit. Seeing her standing at my blue door, her face lit up by the Portuguese sun, was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. She had her grandmother's smile. She had grown in confidence since I had last seen her. The trip to Florence had changed her, opened her up. She carried herself with a new poise, the quiet certainty of a person who has seen a piece of the world and found her place in it. She stayed for 2 weeks. I showed her my new life. We walked the cliffs, we explored the hidden beaches, we ate fresh grilled sardines at a tiny restaurant overlooking the harbor. I showed her my workshop and the garden bench I had just finished. She ran her hand over the smooth, oiled wood. "It's beautiful, Grandpa," she said. Grandma would have loved it. One evening, as we sat in the garden watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink, she finally told me about the letter Eleanor had left for her. "It wasn't about the money," she said, her voice soft. "It was about courage." She wrote about the importance of building your own life, separate from the expectations of others. She said that the greatest act of love is sometimes to build a wall, to protect the things you hold sacred. She told me to be brave, to be independent, and to never, ever let anyone make me feel small. She looked at me, her eyes shining in the twilight. She was talking about Mum and Uncle Michael, wasn't she? But she was also talking about you. She was telling me to be more like you. I had no words. I simply reached out and took her hand. We sat there in silence as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. 2 generations bound together by the love and wisdom of a woman who was gone but would never be absent. Before she left, I took her to Lisbon. I took her to the bank, the Caixa Geral de Depósitos. There, with the help of a very patient bank manager, we completed the final piece of Eleanor's plan. She had established a trust for Lily years ago, a separate fund from the money for the Florence trip, a substantial nest egg designed to ensure her granddaughter's financial independence. It was to be transferred to Lily on her 21st birthday, or at my discretion. I had decided that now was the time. As she signed the final papers, her hand trembled slightly, but her signature was firm and clear. She was no longer just the beneficiary of a legacy. She was now its custodian. "Use it wisely," I said to her as we left the bank. "Use it to build a life that is beautiful and true. Use it to be brave." "I will, Grandpa," she promised. "I will." A year after I left England, I received a letter. It was from Michael. It had been sent to Alastair Finch's office, and he had forwarded it on. It was short, and the tone was unfamiliar. The usual bluster and arrogance were gone, replaced by something that sounded like contrition. He wrote that he and Clara were no longer on speaking terms. He wrote that his wife had been appalled by the story of Lily's money, and that it had caused a deep rift in their own marriage. He wrote that losing his connection to both his father and his niece in such a sudden, brutal way had forced him to do some uncomfortable thinking. He did not apologize, not in so many words. Michael was not a man who knew how to apologize, but he did ask a question. "Are you ever coming home?" I thought about it for a long time. I was home. This place, this small white house by the sea, was my home now. But the house in England, the fortress, was still there. It was still a part of me. I wrote back to him. My letter was even shorter than his. "I will be in England for the last week of September. You and your sister are welcome to come to the house for tea on Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock. I did not know if they would come. I did not even know if they would speak to each other in order to coordinate their arrival. But the invitation was an opening, a small gate in the wall I had built. The terms of engagement, however, were now mine to dictate. Sunday. Tea. Bien. That was all I was offering. A chance for a new beginning, on a foundation of civility and respect. Whether they chose to accept it was up to them. I flew back to England in the last week of September. The air felt cool and damp after the warmth of Portugal. The green of the countryside was a shock to the system. The house was just as I had left it, quiet and still, looked after by a caretaker Alistair had arranged. It felt both familiar and strange, like visiting a place you had lived in as a child. I spent the week preparing. I worked in the garden, which had been well maintained but lacked Eleanor's personal touch. I aired out the rooms. I polished the furniture. I was not preparing for a confrontation, but for a family gathering, however strained it might be. I was setting a stage for a potential reconciliation. On Sunday morning, I baked a pie, an apple pie from the apples on the tree Eleanor and I had planted when we first moved in. The smell of baking apples and cinnamon filled the house, a scent of autumn, of forgiveness, of home. At 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Michael and Clara standing on the porch. They were not together. They had arrived in separate cars, which were parked on opposite sides of the street. They looked at each other with a kind of weary awkwardness. They looked older. They looked tired. "Hello," I said. "Please come in." They stepped into the hall. The house was quiet. The grandfather clock ticked. The scent of apple pie hung in the air. I led them into the living room. I had set a tray with the tea things, just as I had done a year ago. But this time, there was no lawyer. There were no documents. There was just us. We sat in silence for a few moments. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was not a hostile one either. It was the silence of people who have a great deal to say, but no idea where to begin. I decided to begin. "The pie is still warm," I said. "Would you like a slice?" And so we began again, not with accusations or recriminations, not with discussions of property or money, but with tea and with pie, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in the house where we had once been a family. It was not a resolution. It was not a happy ending. It was something smaller and perhaps more realistic. It was a beginning, a fragile, tentative, apple-scented beginning. And for now, it was enough. I finalized my own estate with Alistair Finch before I returned to Portugal. The Eleanor Miller Foundation for the Creative Arts was now a legal entity. The house was protected, its future secured. Its value would now be measured not in currency, but in the creativity and peace it could offer to others. My final act of stewardship was complete. My life now is simple. I work in my garden. I build things in my workshop. I walk by the sea. I have friends. I have peace. I have a home. Sometimes in the evening, I take the framed photograph of Eleanor out into the garden. I sit on the bench I built, the one she would have loved. I sit beside it, and I watch the sun go down. And I tell her everything. I tell her that her garden is thriving. I tell her that Lily went to Florence. I tell her that I finally learned how to make a decent apple pie. And I thank her. I thank her for her foresight, for her wisdom, for her fierce, protective love. I thank her for seeing the storm on the horizon and for building me an ark. And most of all, I thank her for this, for the Casa de Saudade, for the House of Longing, a place where a man can live out his days, not in longing for what he has lost, but in quiet gratitude for everything he was given, a place where the sea is, indeed, louder than the sadness,